Today I'd like to focus on a really beautiful stamp set and a very fun technique that involves a lot of paper distressing and then creating maybe what you would call a shabby chic kind of finish. There's a nice dimension to this project when it's done, and it definitely has a kind of bohemian, shabby chic, multiple texture. It's just, I don't know. It's one of those kinds of cards that I don't gravitate toward unless I start making them, and then I really, really enjoy it. I do want to mention that this card was inspired by a demonstrator during the On Stage at Home event, which was back in November. And that's when there were demonstrators from many different countries who were introducing some of the new stamp sets in the catalog. There were 3 demonstrators that used this stamp set, and they each did fabulous, fabulous projects. And one of the ladies did a project that was kind of similar to this. When I post this, I will obviously mention her name because she needs to have credit for influencing this design. And I'll also put a picture of what she did. But I'm literally going to jump in and just show you how I made this. And as I've already shown you, it starts with one of the stamps from the In the Moment stamp set. And I'm going to use this one. And you could use either of the other 2 very interchangeably in the design that we're going to do. I am going to pull out my Stamparatus here. This is a perfect tool for a card like this because I have 2 stamps that I really want to get placed exactly where I want them to be. And what I'm going to do here is just put my paper down. I have pre-positioned everything so that I don't need to move the paper. I'm using a piece of crumb cake cardstock here, and it is cut to 3 inches wide and 4 1/4 inches high. It's kind of a nice dimension because the 4 1/4 is half of an 8.5 by 11. So you can get quite a few of these pieces out of an 8.5 sheet of paper if it is something that you like once we get it done. I'm using Memento ink, and the purist in me knows that since I will be using water-based inks, I'm going to use markers to color in, that I probably should use StazOn ink on this. You know, in practice, it would work a little bit better, but I have to tell you, sometimes I'm just not a super big fan of StazOn. I don't like how it stains the cling stamps. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to stamp this up, and then I'm going to do a couple of things to this piece of paper before I do my coloring. And what that will do is it will allow the design to dry just a little bit. And then I won't have as much of a worry that I might mess up my stamping when I'm going in and doing the coloring. But theoretically, I really should be using StazOn ink since I will be using water-based ink to do my coloring. And I'm going to scoot her over just a tad. I can tell that I need to get those words a little bit better aligned. And I could see that when I brought those over, that looks much better. And isn't this a fun sentiment? Don't we all need to hear this and not feel guilty when we curl up with a book or grab a glass of wine and watch a movie? That sometimes the most productive thing you can do is relax. And I think that is so, so true. All right, so I have her all done. I'm just going to get my Stamparatus out of the way. And then what I'm going to start doing on this piece is I'm going to start doing some of the, let's call it distressing. And the first step in that is going to be doing some stamping on that focal point. Since I used crumb cake as the cardstock, I'm going to use some crumb cake ink to start doing some of my stamping. I like to use tone on tone when I do distressing. It makes it look a little bit less obvious that you have some stamps in the background. And then I'm going to come back in and I'll use a darker brown. I'll use early espresso when I really want to pull some things out. Now, you folks know me well. You know I love grunge stamps. And I ended up getting a couple of grunge stamps that I'm going to use on this project from another stamp set. The two that I just pulled out, these ones, are from the Painted Poppies stamp set. And I just thought they were really just kind of fun, like splotches of coffee or stains or whatever it is that you want to say those shapes are. And then when I come back in and I do the early espresso, I pulled one out from the Color and Contour and just wanted to add a little bit of interest. So I'm going to grab this larger one first, and this is where I'm not going to overthink. The only thing that I'm going to try not to do is get a lot of the grunge into my design because I am going to be coloring that. So you can see on this finished card, most of the grunge is on the outside, not going into the actual stamping. And I also suggest that you are mindful of designs that you have on your image. For example, the seagulls. I don't want to get right in the middle of the seagulls. I want to make sure that those seagulls are able to be seen. And what I'm doing is I am rotating the stamp so that as I go around and I add some interest, that I'm not repeating the way that the stamp is oriented, because I don't want it to look like it's the same again and again. And if I want to stamp off and maybe put a little bit more on the seagulls, by taking some of that ink off, I'm not going to be adding an awful lot of that grunge background around them. Then I'm going to come in with a smaller grunge. This is also from the Painted Poppies. And I'm just going to sort of fill in a little bit here and there. And again, I'm not overthinking this, and I'm trying to move that stamp into different directions just so it looks like it's not uniform. And my advice is when you're at a point where you think you're close to being done, convince yourself that you are done so that you don't overdo in any kind of stamping and then say, yeah, I really wish I hadn't done that. So the next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to grab that other grunge. This one is a little more defined, as you saw when I brought in the stamp case. It has some nice just pops of the grunge, and that's going to give me a little more definition, and I'm not going to use a lot of this. So I'm going to bring back Early Espresso, and I'm going to make sure that I've got some good ink coverage on here and just go in a little bit here and there. Again, I'm trying not to repeat the way that the stamp is oriented. And on the sides, do a little bit, and then up at the top, I'll also do a little bit. And I really don't want to cover up those seagulls because if I do, nobody's going to be able to tell what they are. And I'm done. Again, I could do more. I'm not going to do any more. So I've added my grunge to the front. The next thing that I want to do is add a little bit of color to the figure here. And I'm going to use a tool that we have not used in, honestly, quite a while. It is a blender pen. And this is what it looks like. And it is in the large catalog. I can actually tell you because I looked it up. It's on page 129. And you get a package of 3 blender pens. They're 3 for $12. And what's nice is they're double-sided and they're the exact same brush on either end. And what these blender pens do is they have a special liquid inside that literally helps the ink blend on whatever the medium is that you're using. Now, most often people use blender pens on white paper, on glossy paper. They don't always use it on cardstock, but I'm going to, as you can tell, I'm going to use this on cardstock this time. And what I've also done is I've brought out a block, an acrylic block. I don't need one this big. It was just convenient for me. I'm going to use this as my palette. And I've grabbed some Stampin' Write markers. The one that I just scribbled on is Pale Papaya. I'm always going to scribble with the brush end. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to come in with my blender pen and I'm going to grab a little bit of that ink. And it's probably a little difficult to see this on camera, but you should see that that tip is starting to pick up some of the ink. And when I go in to my paper, I am bringing that ink in, and that fluid that is in the blender pen is allowing me to spread the ink. Now, one thing which is kind of interesting is when you pick up the ink and you start blending it, the liquid that is in this blender pen is reacting with the paper. I'll flip this paper over in just a second and I'll show you what I mean. And the reason I'm bringing that up is when you're using blender pens on color cardstock, just keep in mind that the color that I'm seeing right now is a lot darker than what it will be when everything dries, because that liquid is going to dry. To take the ink off, all you do is scribble the ink off, and then the tip of your pen is going to start to clear, and you can grab some more color. But what I mean is, even if I use this blender pen with no ink, you can see that there's liquid, and that liquid is making the paper look darker because it's wetting the paper. But as it dries, it's going to become much more clear. So the color that I have in here will become a little bit lighter. Let me show you a larger area that you might want to color, and we'll see a little bit better what I mean by this. So I'm going to do her dress in, this is the, let's see, the Misty Moonlight. To me, it looks kind of like a denim blue when I'm going in and grabbing the ink. And when you grab it, go in and get the ink and then swirl it around a little bit. That way the ink is going to go into that brush a little bit better. Because I chose not to use StazOn when I am coloring, I am trying to avoid some of the areas that have the Memento ink. So I'm really going into where the opening is rather than going right along the line And what that is going to do is help me avoid, hopefully, grabbing any of the black ink and pulling it into the color. Now, if you look in the middle right here, you might think, oh my goodness, that looks like I've pulled in some of the crumb cake. Well, the reason it looks like that is, again, the pen is wet. So when it is working with this color cardstock, it sort of is pulling in the crumb cake color. But as it dries, and you'll see that as I continue doing this, you're not going to see the crumb cake because it's the liquid. It's just wet and it's going to dry, and all you're going to see is the misty moonlight color. The belt or the waist is an area where I'm being careful and I don't want to get any of that black. So rather than run my pen across, I am literally dabbing it. And that's a really good way to try to avoid getting color where you don't want it. That's also the way that I would do her hair. And I'm just going to do her hair, and then I'm going to move to one that I've already got colored, and we're going to work with that one, because once I start doing this, you will see exactly what you need to do. And again, I'm just scribbling that off until there's no color. The brown that I'm using here is cinnamon cider, and it's kind of fun because if you look at the color here on the acrylic block, and then you look at what we're getting when we put it in her hair, it looks darker on the paper. Well, we've got crumb cake rather than a white. So it's going to start to look a little bit darker. This is another area because the hair has a lot of memento black ink. I'm pouncing the color in. I'm not dragging the brush because I don't want to take a chance that I'm going to pull any of that black ink into what I'm doing. And see, I didn't lie to you. If we look back at the area where I started doing the blue, you remember how it looked like that crumb cake color was pulling in? It didn't. When it dried, it looks completely blue. And it's really kind of neat just to see how the colors will work together. And for an image like this, when you're coloring it, what I like to do is sort of visually keep the wood, as an example, going outside the line. There's no real end to the wood. There's nothing that bounds it off on either side or on the bottom. So I'm just taking that cinnamon cider and kind of brushing it so that it sort of goes off the side. And then I finished the coloring by putting some, let's see, for the wine, I decided that she was either having a strawberry daiquiri or a glass of Merlot, not Merlot, of rosé. So I use Magenta Madness in the glass, and I'll show you that in just a second. And then on the hat, I used the Bumblebee. So the two areas that I haven't colored in on here, I'm going to show you one that I did finish before. I've also changed the sentiment, and I did that intentionally. I wanted to show you how versatile this stamp is and how versatile this design is. So I'm going to continue working on the one that says happy birthday. But the only thing different is the coloring that I finished. So again, for the hat, that is Bumblebee. And for the glass, I'm thinking strawberry daiquiri. I'm a strawberry daiquiri versus rosé. I prefer a Pinot Grigio, and that would not have looked incredibly pretty. So we're going to go with a strawberry daiquiri for her. So that's how to get the image and the coloring done. And what you're going to find is, if I bring back in the one that I was working on just a minute ago, the coloring is not going to look perfect. With blender pens and on cardstock, you can see those lines. I'm okay with that. I think it gives it a kind of different look. It's not meant to be perfect. And the further we go into this project, the further you're going to find imperfections. All right, here's where a lot of the fun begins. This is where we're going to start distressing the paper. And the way that I like to do this is I'm going to grab a bone folder. Do not be gentle. This is not meant to be gentle, because what we're going to end up with is a piece of paper that is curling, that is split apart. We're going to split this paper. We're going to really mess around with the fibers. We're going to split the paper. We're going to have some fun. So if you think you are being too harsh, you're not. I'm taking my bone folder. I'm going to put this piece upside down, and I like to start on a corner, and I'm going to curl the heck out of this. If it bends, if it looks like I'm mutilating it, that's good, because I really want to break those fibers down. And we're going to see when we start pulling this apart that there are 2 layers of paper in here. And if you go to the corner, you can see that by doing that, this is starting to split in half. You can see those 2 halves. And there are some tools that you can use. What I'm trying to do here is I want to go along all the edges, and I want to split that paper. So I can use a thumbnail if I want, if that works. And I'm going to show you how I would do that. Sorry that I've got a band-aided thumb here over on the left, but I would just kind of keep running my thumb down and split that paper. Another really good tool for this is a pointed stylus, or in this case, this is my pick tool. And I can get that right in those fibers and start pulling it and start tearing the middle. I do recommend that you come in at the corner. It's just easier to start the corner and then work your way over. And you may find that you have to come back a couple times. This is great if you are frustrated with something, or you just need to sit down and not have to think too hard about getting a project done. It's a great way to do it. So you're going to pull those pieces apart, and you can see that you're going to have different curls. Don't be gentle with this. Mess it up. It's meant to be messed up. And then if you go to the other end, I'm not going to do all of this because I have one that's already been done, but I just want to show you. Just be intentionally distressing and really, really trying to get these fibers to split apart. And it's fun. It's really kind of fun to pull this apart to get a really different look. And if it tears when you're doing this, so much the better, because then it's going to look even more natural. So I'm just pulling all of that. That one came out pretty easily. And see how that tore right there? That's beautiful. I'm not going to care about that. I'm not going to try and hide that tear. I'm going to use that to my advantage. And I'm just going to bring that other piece back, and I've started my distressing. And then if I go to the other side, if I can do this quickly, I'll show you. If not, I'm going to pull in the other one that I've already got done. So again, I am just really trying to get the fibers broken down. And like I said, if you get some little crinkles in here, that's fabulous. It's really going to help in the whole distressed look when you get everything done. And you're just going to run either your thumbnail. I find my thumbnail to be easier. You may not agree with me when you start doing this, but whatever works is going to be the way to do it. And if you find a place that's stubborn, give it a different tool. Try something a little bit different than your thumb. And again, don't be gentle, because if you have some little tears or areas where the fiber pops out, then it's just going to look that much better. So I've got 3 of these sides done. I'm going to show you the next step. And I may just do this one real quick because it's going to be much easier if I can ink the edges and not come back and do that later. So I'm just going to do that 4th side. Hopefully it will split. And because I want it to split easily, it probably won't. Yeah, not too bad yet. And try this on different kinds of paper. I've not tried, it will not work on designer series paper. Let's just be clear there. There's not enough fiber in designer series paper, but different colors are going to give you different effects. And we're going to do the same thing on white. I'm not going to go through all that because I've shown you the process here, but you're going to use the same thing to get the white paper to work. And then once you've got all the sides open, don't be gentle and come back and kind of push the sides in. You want it to look intentionally shabby. You don't want it to be perfect, and that's going to be good enough for what we're going to do. Then what you're going to do is grab ink. And I'm going to go back to the early espresso. And you have a choice here. You can use a large ink pad or you can use a Stampin' Spot. I'm going to go to the Stampin' Spot. And this is my personal preference, but it really is whatever makes you happy. And then you're going to go on the edges and you're just going to add as much or as little ink as you want. And especially in the corners. What I like to do on the corners is where it's got 2 of the corners sort of rolling over each other. I'm going to make sure that the one that's going to be on the bottom gets a good dabbing of ink. And then I'm going to come back and I'm going to put some more on the top. And I'm going to do the same thing on each one. And again, it's absolutely up to you how much you do, how much you don't do, if you leave some of it off, if you don't put the early espresso all the way around. And don't be afraid of this, because as you do it, every time you do this technique, it's going to look different because the paper is going to behave differently. I'm just coming in and on the edge, I'm going to add a little bit of that early espresso ink. And I just find that the Stampin' Spots work better. The big ink pads are going to work just fine. And it just takes a little bit more dexterity. You are going to get ink on your fingers in this. Let it go. Just let it go. And it is inevitable. And if you don't get ink on your fingers, you probably are not going to like the way your project looks. And when you're done, that's kind of what it's going to look like. It's going to be your version of Shabby Chic. And if I bring this back in, you can see that they're very different. The folds are different. Where the early espresso is on the side, very, very different. So every single card you're going to make is going to be unique. The next thing that you're going to do, and I'm not going to do this because I've already got one done, is you are going to do the exact same thing that we just did with a piece of basic white. And when I say the exact same thing that we just did, obviously what I mean is I started with a piece of basic white. This is the same size as the crumb cake piece that we started with. It's 3 inches wide. It's 4 1/4 inches high. And I did the same steps. I took my bone folder. I'll start this one, but I'm not going to finish it. And I started in a corner. And I just really started breaking down the fiber. And then even on this basic white, there are 2 layers. So you can see there are 2 layers of paper that you want to start splitting apart. And I did the exact same process all the way around on that piece of basic white. And I did the exact same thing that I did on the crumb cake, meaning I took my early espresso ink and I went back in and I gave that a little bit of inking on the edge. Now, one thing to keep in mind is, since this white piece is going to be in our background, you don't need to be completely particular about getting all the edges of the white distressed and split apart and have your early espresso on it, because you're not going to see all of it. You're going to see little parts peeking out from the side. And that's really meant to help pull out, in my case, the white cardstock that I used as the card base. I wanted to at least break up the designer series paper and my focal point by having a little bit of white, but you can't see the whole thing. So don't worry about it. As much as you want, you can do. And then what I suggest you do is, before you commit to finishing your white piece, just kind of put the 2 pieces together as if they were going on your card. And you can make sure that as much as you can see of the white is distressed to the level that you want it to be. So we've tackled the front of the card. Now let's talk about the background. The background that is primarily designer series paper. And I looked for a pattern that I thought would do a couple of things. I looked for one that would have sort of a hint of earth tones, a pattern that wasn't super, super busy, but was small enough that you could see the pattern. And I also wanted to pull out a little bit of the color that I used when I did the coloring. And the colors in this designer series paper, I thought, fit the bill. This is from the Daffodil Afternoon designer series paper that is in the Celebration brochure. And it is obviously the opposite of the design that I just showed you. Now, I want to distress this background. I want to do a couple of things. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to bring back in the stamp, the big stamp that I used to do some of my distressing on the other piece that we did, the focal point. And I'm going to bring back in the crumb cake. And I'm simply going to stamp that grunge image around the edges. I want to stamp enough so that when I put the focal point on, there's grunge showing on all 4 sides. I don't need to worry about the center because that will not be showing. And again, I don't need to be perfect. I don't even need to think about it, other than I'm going to sort of switch up how I orient my stamp and just try to get some fun grunge on the edges. And I think using the crumb cake, again, helps to bring out the design that is on the focal point. It really just lets those colors work together, and it makes it look like it was kind of purposeful. So I've done the first layer of the grunging up of the designer series paper, and I should tell you the dimensions on this. This is cut to 4 1/8, so it's a little bit narrower than the card base, 4 1/8 wide and 5 3/8 tall. So it's going to allow that border of the card base to show. So again, 4 1/8, 5 3/8. And then just like I did on the focal point, I'm going to add a little bit of that other grunge, the one that has the dots that are a little bit more pronounced. And like I've been doing, I'm just altering how that stamp goes, not thinking about it a whole heck of a lot. If there's a spot that I miss, I'll just go back and fill it in. And this should be quick because it should really be random. And just adding that in. And like I said, I'm not worrying about the middle. You're not going to see the middle. The middle doesn't matter. If I don't get that corner, I'll just come back in and grab the corner with my stamp. And there we go. So there's the piece that will be going directly onto the card base. Now I do want to do a little bit of distressing on this piece as well. And it's going to be a different kind of distressing. The one that we already did, we really distressed that paper. I mean, we've torn it, we've bent it, we have mutilated it, let's be honest. And the effect is really cool, I think. The distressing on the designer series paper is much more subtle, and it's really meant to give it a kind of a scratchy edge. And then I'm going to put some early espresso on the edge of the paper. And to do that, there are tools. This is a tool I've had forever and a day. And then there are tools that you have that you can also use to do distressing. The way that this tool is designed is you can see how it has that V cut and there's a blade that's going horizontally. If I take this tool and I put it on the edge of my paper and I literally pull it, that blade is going to fray the edge and give it just a kind of interesting non-uniform edge, and it's going to make it look a little distressed. That's what I want. If you don't have this kind of tool, don't worry, grab your scissors. You're going to make a V, you're going to hold your scissors open, and you're going to take your paper and you're going to run that V along the edge as well. And you're going to get a distressed look. And you can do this a little bit or a lot. See how that's giving it a distressed look? So you don't need to use anything but a pair of scissors that you've already got in your stash to give it a really cool distressed look. And it's also going to break the fibers on the side so that you're going to get a non-uniform edge. It's not going to be completely straight anymore. That's okay. What will happen when you do this is you're going to get little shavings of paper dust that will fall on your work surface. And I just advise you that once you've done whatever kind of distressing you want, that you just sort of wipe those pieces of paper dust away. And I'll show you why in just a minute. So I've just got one more edge to do. And this is pretty quick as well. There's some other tools. You can get different kinds of distressing. Different blades will cause different ways that the paper will look after you've done your distressing. But I've done all four of my corners. And now what I'm going to do is I'm just going to wipe that dust away. And I'm also going to take my finger and wipe the dust off the edge. And the reason I'm doing that is I'm going to be inking my edges. And it's just a clean way to make sure that the dust doesn't get into your ink. Because if, and I've done this, if you get a lot of dust into your ink, the dust can actually get on stamped images and you're not going to get as perfect an image as you might want. And all I'm doing here is I'm running the ink along the edge because I want it to have a little bit more of that early espresso. So I'm just putting that right along the edge. Again, not overthinking. And I guarantee you my left hand is going to get ink. because inevitably I am going to hold the paper so that that side that I just inked up is going to run right over my hand, and you will get inky. That's just the way it is. So now I've got, see, I've got ink all over my hand. I'm just going to wash that off really quick. But I have my piece of paper for the background all set. And now we're at the point where we can assemble. And there's nothing mystical or magical about this. So if you're not at the point of having your pieces done, don't worry. This is a very, very straightforward project. The card base is basic white. I did use thick basic white. It's the normal 8.5, 5.5, and then on the 8.5 side, scored at 4 1/4. I am going to put this piece, I'm actually going to grab one that's been sitting on the side and drying, just because I don't want to take the chance of getting too much ink on my fingers at the moment. But this is the exact same thing that I just did. And I am going to adhere this piece directly to the card base. And using my favorite adhesive, good old Tombow, and putting that straight down. And you will see that there's enough room outside the size of that designer series paper to give me a nice little border right around the outside. And because I put the early espresso on the edge, that is so much more defined. And what's really fun to me is if I look up here, for example, where I distress that paper, it's no longer a straight line. Down here, it's no longer a straight line. And it is going to help in just pulling the overall design together. So that's our base all set. Now let's talk about the focal point. You don't want to adhere these pieces onto your card just yet, because what we're going to do is we're going to put some decorative trim on that piece, but we also want to put the two pieces together first. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to just kind of take a look at these two pieces and figure out how I want them to go together. Do I want the white piece to be like this, or do I want it at 180 degrees? Do I want it to be like that? Actually, I think I like that a little bit better, just from the way that the paper works on each of the corners. So when I figure out how I want these two pieces to work together, I'm going to glue them together. And very, very straightforward. I'm just going to take some Tombow glue. I'm focusing on the middle. I don't need to put anything on the edge because I want the edges to continue to behave the way that those fibers are going to allow them to continue to look. And then I'm going to tilt this up toward me just a tad because I want to make sure that I'm getting my paper kind of aligned the way I want it to look. And I'm paying attention to the edges, how those corners are coming together. I can still futz around with this. I can still make my paper, continue to curl if I want it to. And I'm just playing around with this, making sure that I do like the way that it's all working together. And I might make sure that that's really folding over down at the bottom. All right, that looks pretty good. So the next thing is to make this twine. And I got this crazy idea when I was working on this card that I wanted to use some of this really nice twine, but I didn't want to just wrap it around. I wanted to do something a little different. And nobody's probably going to recognize or care about what I did, but I actually braided it. I know, crazy, but I did. It's okay. And the way I did that is I cut one piece twice as long as I wanted it. And I just made sure that it was going to work. It's going to be long enough. Then I cut a third piece that was a little bit longer than half of that original. And all I'm going to do here is I'm going to tie these together because I literally want to braid these. Yep, I know it's a little crazy, but that's all right. So I'm going to tie that together. And then I have my 3 ends that I can use to plait, to do like a little braid. And I'm going to use a little piece of washi. Yep, this is crazy. And hold that still while I braid them together. And I don't know why I thought this was a brilliant idea, but I did. So I'm just doing a braid. And I thought it would be kind of fun because it looked a little bit chic-y and a little boho and just different than wrapping the linen twine around. So we're doing this. And I'm just going to make sure that it's long enough that when I put it onto the front, that it will wrap around the back. And obviously there are so many options. I did think that the crumb cake, again, the kind of neutral color really played well because it is very organic. You know, it's just very, very easy to look at, and it really goes well with the design that's on the front. And I think that's going to be long enough. I'm going to test and see if that's long enough to wrap around. It almost is. So just do a little bit more. And then I'll tie it off to make sure that it's not going to unbraid when I put it on. But you can use anything. You don't even have to put any kind of ribbon or decoration on the front. It's completely up to you. All right, so now I know that that is long enough. I'm just going to hold the ends, come back over and literally just tie this off, pull all 3 pieces together and tie it off. And then I'm going to come in and just going to align that with, I wanted to do sort of the bottom of her skirt and give it a little bit of a definition. And then on the other side, I'll use this super technical tool, the Scotch tape. And I'm going to put that Scotch tape so that that thread is just going to stay down. So I'm just going to go over here, do the other side. I'm kind of eyeballing this to see if I like where it's going to be. I'm also leaving enough of this. I'm not going to gather it really tight because eventually I'll probably go back in and put a couple of glue dots on the underneath the twine so it will hold and it won't pop up and it will just look like it's really intentional. And I'll come back in over here. Grab that and make sure that that's going to work for me, and that should be fine. All right, so now I have my twine that, again, I can put a couple of glue dots in here and just get it so that it attaches to the front. And now I can go ahead and glue this piece to the front of my card. And I'm going to make sure that the edges of that twine stay put. And I'm also going to make sure that that tape doesn't move by putting a little bit of glue on there. And I'll just put glue down the middle. I don't need to worry about the edges because I don't want those to stick down. And then I'm going to eyeball this. I'm focusing on where she's leaning on, that little piece of wood and trying to get that kind of straight. And looking at the top and the bottom, the left and the right. And then when I think it's pretty straight, I'll give that a nice push. And again, I'm not worrying about whether these are popping up or not. I want them to. I want it to really have a nice curl to the effect. The last thing that I'll do on that front is I'm going to grab a little bit more of my linen thread. When it comes off the spool, it's very twisted. If you pull it through your finger and your thumbnail, you can get it to be much more straight. And I'm just going to come over, pop this underneath, and tie a bow. And again, when I finally finish this off, when I get all the embellishments done and I've got the little glue dots underneath, I will come back and put a touch of glue on that knot so that it's not going to go anywhere. Okay. And then the last bit of embellishment, I'm going to bring back the card that I finished before we got together. The last bit of embellishment that I put on this card are a couple of these new iridescent rhinestone jewels. And they're very, very subtle. There are two that are up here in the corner, these two, and then one right down here tucked up underneath. And they go really well with the designer series paper and give it a little sparkle without too much sparkle. I didn't want to make this fancy because I thought that would take away from the bohemian chic-y look. So that's the card. You can tell that on this card, the one that I finished versus the one that I'm working on, a couple of things aren't done yet. This twine is put onto the card. I used a couple of glue dots and just folded them over and then tucked them underneath. So that twine is really nice and flat. I'm going to do that over here as well. Come back in here and I'll put a couple of glue dots. And then I will add a little bit of the iridescent rhinestone jewels. But there you got it. And this kind of design, at least for me, it's just fun. It's different. And there are so many things that you can do by tearing the fibers apart and using them on a project. I hope you've enjoyed it. I hope you will try it. I would love to see what you make. And it really is a lot of fun to do.